Happy New Year. Hello and welcome back to the podcast that is always up to speed with Formula One here on the Overtime Media Network. You have Mark Hamilton and Mark Daly. Welcome to the first episode of calendar 2021. I think, and it probably goes without saying that we all hope that this will be a much better year than maybe what we've experienced in calendar 2020. And if F1 has anything to say about it, we have an absolutely action-packed calendar to look forward to. And we'll probably get into it next week, but I think there may already be a little bit of disruption coming. But like I said, our first podcast since Christmas, our first podcast of the new year. To my dear co-host, how was the holidays? How was time spent with family?
The last 10 days, 2 weeks has been absolutely wonderful. I hope everybody else had a good holiday season wherever they are. And I'm just chuckling to myself here, Mark, as we're about to kick the show off, because we're going to do the one thing that nobody in 2021 wants to do and talk about 2020. We're kind of in a funny kind of time here. You know, there's still plenty of news considering what's going on in Formula One, but we'd be, I think, a little bit remiss. We'd be a little bit, I'd say, almost derelict in duty if we didn't go back and address some of the very important moments over the last year in 2020. And it was funny too, I was thinking that even though nothing has really changed since January 1st, what the new year means is new opportunities, new beginnings, and new hope. And like we were talking before we actually went on the air, that hopefully once we power through the next month, maybe 6 weeks, through the darkest point of the winter here, that we might truly start seeing some light at the end of the tunnel. But until then, we do have, and my brother, just to sort of digress a little bit, he was saying, we were talking about this over the holiday. And it was funny, we thought, well, the discussion was that when it comes to something like pro sports and all those sorts of things, and whether or not they're really important or not in our lives, that the last year, even though that there were so many other things going on, that the sports that were able to get up and running, you know, they did prove that they're worth, because they were a ray of hope, a ray of distraction, whatever you want to call it. And I think that it gave people something to take their mind off that heavier and darker and very, very important issues and things that have been going on in the rest of our lives. So
yeah, I completely agree.
I think that just from that point alone, that was one of the things that we should talk about. But we wanted to go down. This is like basically our top 10 of 2020 list, and we have a whole bunch. Some of them are going to be kind of lead into another ones, and other ones, you know, they can kind of fit in there anywhere. But I think the top two that we have in our list, I think they're both equally important, but in different ways. So I think we're going to kick it off, Mark, and we should have done like a little bit of we should have had a drum roll or some sort of custom audio for this show. But I think that our very first or number one on our top 10 list was the fact that in 2020 we actually had a season at all, even though it was delayed. What was it, 3.5 months, 4 months, whatever it was, by the time we got up and running at the beginning of July. The wait was definitely worth it.
Yeah, I completely agree. Just to kind of echo your comments, you know, I think for a lot of people in calendar 2020, I really think that the hardest part was probably that March, April, May, June period. And I think for so many people, professional sports racing, it just becomes part of your life and it's part of your routine, and you're conditioned to look for scores and watch sports. And when all of a sudden it just all evaporates and you don't know when it's coming back, I think that was very alarming for a lot of people like myself, who depends on sports for that escapism, for that kind of cultural attachment to something beyond the four walls of your own home. And I think when sports did resume, even though obviously we saw an escalation in COVID cases and the crisis really exploded again with the second wave in the fall and the winter, I think there was a degree of normalcy because we were able to see sports and we were able to talk about sports. And at the end of the day, nothing is more important than saving lives and the health and well-being of our health systems. But I think as a society, we need these distractions, and these distractions are good. So it was really, really, really great when Formula One did return. The one thing before we jump into this, and I asked only because I was listening to the Checkered Flag podcast the other day, and they had a really great kind of segment to kick off their 2020 top 10. But are you familiar with, and I'm sure you are, but every single year, Formula One issues kind of a DVD, a Blu-ray, which is kind of a review of the calendar. and they are notorious for giving these the crappiest possible titles. And if you look back in 2013, the title was Formula One 2013. Who can stop him? Obviously, a reference at that point to Vettel.
Red Bull.
2014, the title of the DVD was It Was Fair. In 2015, the title was That's What Champions Do. And then in 2016, and this is hilarious, in 2016, the title of the F1 Blu-ray box set that recaptured the entire season was They Did Their Best. So I ask you, and I'm going to put you on the spot, if you were to issue or if you were producing the 2020 F1 official Blu-ray box set, what would you title it?
Oh boy, yeah, you really are putting me on the spot. I don't know if I can come up with something as equally crap as those other ones. Oh boy, what can we do? 2020. Yeah, we got to come up with something memorable here. 2020. Thank God it's over.
I think that would be good. I think that would be very, very, very good. Yeah. I'll stick with that one. You know what? I'll send a tweet to the Formula One media group and make sure that they get that on the box, because obviously the fourth graders that they depend on to come up with these things aren't doing much better. So yeah, and you know, I think that's a great segue. And I think obviously if we're going to review the 2020 season and kind of look at some of the top 10 moments, I think it really goes back to Australia. And I think to kind of set the scene, by the time the Formula One circus had landed in Melbourne, the NHL in North America was shut down. The NBA had already suspended its season. And I think there was a lot of hesitation about the fact that they even flew out there. And, you know, I'll open with a quote from Lewis Hamilton at the press availability on the Thursday. But he says, you know, and I quote, "Cash is king. The fact is we are here. I hope the fans take precautions. Walking through the pits today, it was as normal as ever." And he went on to comment about the fact that at that point, the NBA had suspended their season. The NHL suspended their season. The premier soccer leagues in Europe had suspended their seasons. Yet here we were in Melbourne, ready to race on the Thursday. And Thursday night, Andrew Benson, reporting for the BBC, put out a story that said the race was going to be canceled. F1 itself didn't actually cancel the race until the Friday morning, almost an hour before the first practice. We learned later that a lot of the drivers, including Sebastian Vettel and Kimi Räikkönen, had already flown out by the time that the race was actually canceled. And we also learned that even if Formula One and the FIA were going to go ahead with this race, there were only 3 teams in Red Bull and AlphaTauri and Racing Point that were even willing to contest at that point. But in hindsight, it's remarkable to think that we went to Australia knowing that the Chinese Grand Prix had already been postponed, that we set up, the teams had assembled the cars, and it wasn't until Friday morning, an hour before free practice, that they finally canceled that race. And you look back and we forget all of this because the year's been so busy, but that kind of put the entire sport on pause. And at that point, I don't think we had any idea what the calendar was going to look like or whether there was going to be a calendar at all.
Well, that's right. It sort of really set up this sort of cascading or snowballing effect of these cancellations and these postponements. And it really, we went into this really, really bizarre time. I mean, that point in March when everything was getting canceled, like sporting events, and then people were like, countries around the world were going into lockdown, was really a seminal moment. I mean, just across like humanity, right? And we went into that really bizarre second half of the spring, into April, into May, and then into the beginning of summer in June. But at least by the end of May, there was some really serious rumblings that this thing is going to get up and running, that they're targeting the beginning of July. And we initially had this sort of this initial batch of races that it looked like something was going to happen up till the traditional summer break at the end of July, beginning of August with Hungary. And then it was just going to be, okay, well, what's going to happen after that? And we kind of had these sort of modules of the season that kind of, they kind of came together at different points, and we kind of leapfrogged a little bit all over the place. And I have to give it to them that the way that they managed to get it going, and the way that they managed to get this sort of the F1 bubble, this little biosphere that they operated in. And I think, I can't remember how many tests they did in total, but I think they had, what was it, several dozen test positive cases. I mean, the most notable ones, of course, were Sergio Perez and Lewis Hamilton. I mean, that's just obvious. And Lance, can't forget about Lance Stroll.
Yeah.
I mean, the 3 drivers, and then you had a number of team personnel testing positive for COVID, and then ancillary personnel or people that work at the facilities and tracks like that. but I think that the test positive rate was something 1 in 1,000. I think that's what it turned out to be. So, and the tens or hundreds of thousands or however many tests that they did, I think it's phenomenal that first of all, they're able to come up with the framework, they're able to operate in it, and despite the several high profile cases, that ultimately it worked very well. And I'm still kind of sitting here today a little bit in disbelief that, number one, they actually were able to pull it together and they were able to pull it off. And we actually had a pretty entertaining season. I mean, you can look at the points total, and I mean, a lot of people just remember Lewis won, Mercedes won again, but I mean, there were some very entertaining races in there. So all in all, I think it sets up nicely for next year. I know that there's some questions right now surrounding Australia for March, just to the COVID situation down there, and the fact that they got to start putting together this temporary circuit, which is obviously different than some of these replacement tracks that we saw last year, like Mugello and Portimao, Imola, tracks that we, or Nürburgring, another one that we haven't seen for a very long time. The difference with Melbourne is being a temporary circuit is that it's not up and running and ready to go, where some of these other races or venues were like, okay, you want to come race here, we just need X number of weeks to get up and running, whereas Melbourne needs months. So it would be a shame at this point that if it got canceled, but if it does, hopefully it's a postponement. But we're on track for another epic season, and they've proven that the F1 bubble can work. And I hope that well, I mean, we're going to be living with COVID for a while. We're going to be living with the F1 bubble for a while. So I hope that that the delay, if there is one to the start of the season, isn't longer than that initial race. But we'll see.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that's a great recap. And I think you touched on, as dark as that period was in March and April, May and June, the outcome was that, to your point, we did get to see some good races. We got to see some fun races. And ultimately, we got to see some tracks that maybe we haven't seen in a while, or maybe we've never seen on an F1 calendar at Imola, Mugello, Portimao, Nürburgring. And we went back to Turkey for the first time in 2011. And,
yep.
2011 was an interesting race, and this one was equally as much, partly because of the surface, which we'll probably talk about a little bit later on. But ultimately, again, you and I have both credited Liberty for putting together a really substantial calendar and putting together a championship that I don't believe warrants an asterisk. So all things considered, I think we're in a good place. And whether Australia happens or not, I think Bahrain is guaranteed. So we are going to see Formula One racing in March, and I think that's a total lock at this point.
Yeah, and that's a great thing to be able to look forward to. So let's kick off the next part of the conversation here. We might have to bridge it with the break in between, but the other big thing was Lewis's 7th World Championship, equaling the immortal Michael Schumacher. And, I mean, Lewis was obviously before that with all the records he held, and the 6 world titles, was already in that elite pantheon of Formula One legends. But equaling that 7th world title of Michael Schumacher's is just on another level, right? It is just it was one of those records. I think so many people thought that once Michael won that final world title, I mean, it was obvious after he left Ferrari, went to Mercedes, that latter part of his career, that it just more world titles weren't going to be coming at that point. But it just seemed that all those Schumacher records that he set in those glory years with Ferrari, and even those first couple world championships with Benetton in the 1990s, it just seems it had that feel that they were going to stand for a long, long time. And I think it's a real testament to Lewis Hamilton and to Mercedes, to what they've done since 2014 is absolutely impressive. So that is our number 2. And I think that, had it not been for COVID and the whole rejigging of the entire season, obviously Lewis and what he accomplished this year would have been our natural number 1 pick for 2020.
And I really don't have a lot to add to this one. We've talked obviously about Lewis and his successes at length over the last couple of months. I think in the historical rear view mirror of Formula One, I think 2021 will probably eclipse 2020, because I think everything is lining up for another Mercedes constructors and drivers title. And I don't think there is any reason whatsoever to doubt that Hamilton will secure championship number 8. And ultimately, I think that's the one that will be the most important in the rearview mirror of kind of the Formula One historical championship. So I think it was great. He had an incredible season. He was incredibly reliable. He didn't have a single retirement. He missed one race, to your earlier point, because unfortunately he had COVID towards the end of the season. But ultimately, he was an absolute rock star. He put in reliable races. And, we'll talk about the British GP in a couple of minutes, but I don't really have a lot to add. I think the only thing is that this 7th title will be a short-term celebration, because I think there's every reason to think he'll win another title in 2021.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've said this on the show probably now for the past, well, I think I've probably said it as every season since I started the podcast. Until proven otherwise, I am really hesitant to bet against Mercedes, and especially bet against Lewis Hamilton on on a regular basis. I mean, we've seen some little hiccups here and there, especially like the British Grand Prix, where we've seen that they've had some issues, but they're quickly figured out and sorted out. And just over the longer stretch, over the course of an entire season, because nobody, not even Mercedes, is going to have a perfect season. I mean, they come pretty close to it. But the thing is that over the course of 20 races, 21 races, 23 races, whatever the calendar calls for, that it almost seems foolish in my mind to bet against those guys at any time.
I completely agree.
All right. Well, I think that's a good place to leave it for the first two on our top 10 countdown for 2020. So we're going to take a quick break here on the Overtime Media Network. So don't go away. We'll be back in just a moment. All right. Well, welcome back to the podcast. It is always up to speed with Formula One. Mark and Mark here, counting down the top 10 moments of 2020 here on the podcast. And also for those of you watching on the YouTube channel. So we went through in the first segment, obviously the two big ones. One, that we had a season at all, what with the COVID landscape we've all been living with for the past year or so. And then number two was Lewis and his 7th World Championship and all the records that he broke and tied and set and all those things last year. So number three is actually a bit of a compilation of a couple of different bullet points that you and I had, Mark, when we were talking about putting this show together over the past couple of days. And I've condensed it down into the rise of Racing Point / Aston Martin, because boy, I mean, if the first segment took, the first 2 points, there is a lot to unpack about Racing Point over the last calendar year. I mean, they turned a lot of heads turning up to Barcelona with the pink Mercedes with the RP20. Obviously there was a lot of there's a natural connection there because they have the Mercedes power unit. And then, there was a lot of discussion about that, even though that Otmar Szafnauer, the team principal, admitted that they borrowed heavily from the W10 design concepts from the 2019 Mercedes car. And that initially they had a lot of setbacks before they figured out the aero package and got the car to work. And then, of course, this led into these rolling protests from Renault through the opening portion of the year. This investigation, ultimately the fine and the points deduction. But that not being, not just taking that into account. I mean, they still finished very well in the Constructors' Championship. They won a race at the end, and those things were coming. I mean, they were found, of course, like I said, to be in violation because, the brake duct issue, ultimately that was sorted out. But they did design a good car. And the thing is that whenever somebody comes up with a good concept in Formula One, everybody else seems to copy that concept. So I can see why they borrowed heavily from the design, like the aero design and concepts that they had on the W10. But I mean, I think that they did a good job, apart from the cheating, which they got busted for. But a lot of the things like Turkey, the way that Lance and Sergio ran off, and they should have. I mean, the thing is, Lewis just drove a masterclass of the race on that particular day on that very slippery track. But I mean, there were good things coming throughout the year. It seemed like it was going to happen for them sooner or later before Bahrain too.
Yeah, I think 2021 is potentially going to be and you could argue that in some ways 2020 was a bit of a breakthrough season for this team. Obviously, they won a race, and Lance had a couple of strolls. Lance had a couple of podiums. He had a pole, which I think was epic considering the conditions in Turkey on that day. And I think one of the BBC race commenters had referenced the Turkey track as Slippy McSlipface during the course of the race weekend. So obviously, that wasn't to be disregarded. But I think this team is obviously on the verge of doing big things. And, prior to the Lance Stroll Consortium, it was a small operation based at Silverstone with about 400 people working in the factory and with the team. Obviously, since the Stroll Consortium's moved in, the headcount at the factory's almost doubled. They're close to finishing the construction of a new factory on site. Subsequent to his purchase of the Force India team, Lawrence Stroll has obviously made a very significant investment in the Aston Martin road cars division as well, of which he now owns 25%. And Toto Wolff has subsequently invested. And since 2017, Mercedes-Benz themselves have been incrementally investing as well in that team. Next year, we get to abandon Racing Point as a name. And I always thought that Racing Point was something of a holdover, a temporary name. It never logically made sense as a long-term marketing exercise.
Yeah.
But I'm
on me, to be honest.
What's that?
It's grown on me a little bit. I have to.
Really?
Yes, it has. Yeah.
So, I think one of the things that really did frustrate me was early on, I wanted to get some Racing Point merchandise. I've been to a couple of races. I wanted to support a Canadian-based team with a Canadian-based driver. But they always had very, very little, like maybe a hoodie, maybe a T-shirt. And I always thought that they're probably not producing a ton of merchandise because they don't plan to kind of retain this brand long term. But yeah, and I also like the pink. But we saw a couple of days ago that they've officially rebranded as the Aston Martin Works Formula One team on Twitter, on social media. They've said goodbye to the Racing Point pink. We'll probably learn more about who their principal sponsors are over the next couple of weeks and months. But I think I'm incredibly excited to see what they can do as a Works team. And let's just be very clear to the listeners out there that the integration between Aston Martin as a road car division and Mercedes as a road car division was pretty substantial. Mercedes now feeds engines and electrical systems to Aston Martin for the road cars. And obviously, we're probably going to see a similar relationship in the Formula One division. But I'm incredibly excited for 2021. And hopefully, if they can build a little bit more reliability into that package. We talked a little bit about Hülkenberg's disappointing no starts in Britain earlier in the season and some of the other issues. But I'm incredibly excited to see what can happen. But that said, I keep having to recalibrate my expectations because I keep thinking we're going to go into 2021 with an improved car, an improved package, rebranding and the same drivers. But it's going to be a totally different driver lineup because Lance is returning, obviously, but we're going to bring in Sebastian Vettel, who's coming off the worst season of his career. So 2021 could be a very, very, very interesting season. And I think if you ask anyone, their expectation is third place in the Constructors' Championship.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, you touched on nicely just there, Lawrence Stroll and his consortium coming in 2018. And there was not much of a pulse left in that body when they came in the middle of that year. I mean, that team was literally on its final couple of breaths when they came in there. And it was interesting, too, because when they came back from the summer break, I mean, the injection of cash they just put into that team initially, I mean, we saw almost an immediate improvement in the cars. I mean, it didn't obviously vault them up to contend for podiums, but I mean, it did make a difference right off the bat. But, fast forward just a couple of years later, and here's a team that finishes fourth in World Championship in the Constructors, only 7 points behind McLaren. And had they not had that, that penalty applied to them, big fine midway through the season, that would have been a lock. They would have been obviously much higher up in the Constructors' Championship. They would have not have been fourth. It just would have been, at that point, how much closer to Red Bull would they have been? I mean, I think they had 195 points. McLaren had just, I think, 202, 203, whatever it was. So very, very impressive. But it, like you say, I mean, you have this, Lawrence coming in there, and considering how successful he is in his other businesses, it's not a vanity project for him. The amount of money that he's invested in the parent company and in the Formula One team, I mean, this is hundreds of millions of pounds or dollars, whichever way you shake it. It's a lot of money. They're not just there just to get their faces on TV and things like that. They're there to race. And I think it's an exciting time to see where this team is going to go. I mean, obviously they've had some delays in the new factory and whatnot, but I think that there's a very, very positive vibe around this team at the moment. And it's going to be one to watch next year. And I think that the way that this season finished up, with McLaren just beating them to third in the championship, and the way that they've revived their fortunes, is another great storyline to go into and follow all throughout 2021. Because as impressive as Racing Point has been, the way that they've revived themselves and gotten to a point that they've never previously been, is also the fairly quick turnaround that their rivals in McLaren have been as well. So like I say, it's going to be fascinating. It's going to be fun to watch in 2021.
I'll add one thing as well, and I'm not doing this because I'm a homer, because I'm a Canadian, but I think oftentimes, especially in the UK, and especially when a Formula One team enters into administration,
Yep.
even if somebody comes along and offers up a sum of money, rarely does that team ever, or that company or that enterprise really ever resume its identity. I'll be very honest. When a company enters into administration, somebody comes along and they buys them and they strip them for parts. They gut cost, they gut all of the resources, and they just sell it off for spare parts. But I think Lawrence deserves all the credit in the world, because he bought this team, and he, to your point, has invested hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds, euros, dollars into improving it and increasing headcount and increasing resources. He deserves all the credit in the world, because for all we know, if the Mazepin family had bought this team, it could have been stripped for parts. It could have been run into the ground. I think he deserves the credit for saving the jobs, for creating new jobs, and just kind of reinforcing how credible and how sustainable this sport is if the teams are backed by the right type of people. So that's just kind of my last comment there. But I think he deserves all the credit in the world for what he's done.
Well, absolutely. And if you look just at the end of the Ecclestone era, just look at a couple of teams that disappeared there, like Manor Racing and
Totally.
Caterham. I mean, remember that crowdfunding thing that Caterham did? What was in 2014, 2013,
Yeah.
whatever it was, to get them to the last couple of races. That I think I put in like 5 or 10 pounds or something. Like that. So I've got the little refuel Caterham thing. I thought it was kind of a cool thing to do. But anyways,
that's awesome.
All right, well, let's go into number 4 before we hit the next break. And we've already touched on it a couple of times. So one of the most memorable wins this year was Lewis's win at the British Grand Prix. So Mark, take it away. I know you've been bursting to talk about this one.
Bursting to talk about it, but I had to go back and review the race, because it's funny, because even though the entire Formula One season happened in the last 6 months, it was so condensed and so compressed that I forgot, and unfortunately quite a lot of it. And I think it's kind of embarrassing that I forgot so much of this race. So for starters, you know what? Lewis has been an absolute monster at Silverstone, including this race. He's won there 7 times. I think he's qualified on pole 6 or 7 times. It's his home race. I've been there. I've seen him race in front of that crowd. And there's probably, as far as the F1 calendar is concerned, there's probably no equivalent spectacle in terms of energy and atmosphere. So right away, it was very surreal to watch him race at Silverstone with the stands empty. So right away, that the atmosphere was gone a little bit. But that said, you know what? We go into the first of 2 races at Silverstone. He qualifies on pole. Bottas was 2nd. Max was 3rd. And it looked and felt like a largely conventional race for the first probably 2 acts. And it was really in the final acts where things started going a little bit haywire. And Bottas, and we saw on the broadcast, began reporting that he was having visibility issues due to vibrations in the car, and it wasn't necessarily clear what that was. Ultimately, he had a tire failure, and he limped back to the pits. 2 laps to go, Sainz had a tire failure. The Red Bull team brought in Verstappen preemptively because they feared that he could potentially also have a tire issue. And I think there's a lot of speculation at this point, like, what is causing these tire issues? Why are these graining issues happening now? The track was clear. It was dry. It wasn't a particularly hot race. But all of a sudden, with basically a lap left, the Mercedes team had cautioned Hamilton that, hey, look, understand, because I don't think at that time Hamilton was as aware of what was happening around him in terms of the tire failures as we were watching at home, because I think sometimes the teams are very cautious about what information they provide to their drivers. If it's information that's not going to be useful and strategic in helping them win a race or make decisions that will lead to a race, I think they sometimes try to put them in a bubble and isolate. So I don't know how much information Hamilton knew at that point. He probably knew that Bottas had a tire failure. He may not have known about Sainz. So the team towards the very end of the race came on and they said, hey, look, you know what? You need to be very, very, very careful with those tires for the balance of this race. And at this point, there was about a lap, maybe a lap and a half left. With 8 corners left, or I think on the 8th corner of the final lap, Hamilton himself suffered a tire failure. almost a complete explosion of that front left tire. At that point, he was about 30 seconds in front of Max. And the only reason the gap was so big was because the Red Bull team had preemptively brought Max in, hoping that they could avoid a potential tire failure that could have cost them a podium. So we are now in this position, and it was one of the most, short of Italy, which I think we'll probably talk about, it was one of the most thrilling, compelling finishes to a race that season, because you have Hamilton, who had a 30-second lead, but he's now racing on 3 tires, and you have Max, one of the most vicious racers on the circuit, who can absolutely make up time like no other racer, chasing him down corner after corner after corner. And all you could do is sit there stunned, watching Hamilton literally limp home while you have Max chasing him down on fresh tires. And ultimately, Hamilton wins. He wins by 6 seconds, but Max was able to take 24 seconds out of that lead in the last 2/3 of a lap. And obviously, Hamilton ends up winning. It was his 87th race win, his 7th win in Britain, and his 3rd straight win of the season. But wow, what a close to that race.
It was crazy. And if that tire failure, it wasn't a puncture. It was just a complete disintegration of the tires.
Totally.
Part there. If it happened one corner sooner, then obviously Max wins that race. It was because I remember it too, because up until that point, it wasn't really the most exciting race. I seem to remember.
Yeah, it was a procession, very much a procession to that point.
It was. And the funny thing is too, like, even though that it was pretty close to the time of year that we see the British Grand Prix under normal circumstances, it wasn't really a situation that we've really seen before, with those sort of issues with tire wear and graining and stuff like that. So it was very, very bizarre, but it was an exciting finish, and it really sort of set things up very interesting for the week after, for the 70th anniversary Grand Prix, because I have to admit that once the calendar got finalized, and we were going to have like these double headers at certain racetracks, like at Austria at the Red Bull Ring, at Silverstone, and then at in Bahrain. Well, of course, it's like here you have the traditional track, and then the outer track, the sort of oval one, which we saw at the end of the season. They all worked, and I have to be honest, with the 2 races we saw at Silverstone and Austria, 2 weeks was enough. But after that first race at Silverstone, with Lewis, crawling across the finish line, it kind of really set up a lot of questions for the week thereafter. But it was very funny, because had that happened in a normal year, that place just would have gone bananas by the time Lewis had crossed start finish to take that checkered flag. I mean, especially if Max was right on his gearbox like he was at the end, I mean, the place would have erupted. So, I mean, it was an epic win, unfortunately, in front of an empty empty grandstands around the track. But
I was at Silverstone in 2018 when he won pole in qualifying on the Saturday, and when his time went up on the scoreboards around the track, and 125,000 people that were present saw that, you could feel it in the ground. It wasn't just the noise, but you could feel it in the ground, where people were stomping and cheering and jumping up and down. But yeah, I think that's the only thing that could have made that better, is if people were able to witness it in person. But yeah, ultimately it was a fantastic race. And like you said, it teed up the 70th Grand Prix, which followed the race weekend after.
Absolutely. All right. Well, time for another break here on the show. And when we come back, we're going to talk about something that we typically don't talk about on our top 10 countdown. So you want to stick around for that. So don't go away. We'll be back in just a moment. All right. Well, welcome back to the show. It's Mark and Mark here, counting down our top 10 moments from the 2020 Formula One World Championship. We've been through 1 to 4, and we're now we're halfway there. And as I hinted at before the break, we're going to talk now about something that typically is not a big issue, but one of our moments from this year is the Mercedes mistakes, and that was costly in a couple of races. One was at Monza, and then also in Russia, when Lewis was penalized for the practice starts outside of the allowed area. The other one was in Monza, when he came in and into the pits when the pit lane was closed. That one was interesting. That was, I think, more a little bit of a reaction reaction call and just a bit of bad timing. But these sorts of things, and also that that botched tire stop at Bahrain with George Russell filling in, those sorts of things were very, very un-Mercedes like. I mean, like we said, we've seen some, you know, where they've had issues at certain races, and they sort of over the years, they're not immune from it. Nobody is, but the thing is, they're typically far and few between. So to see them these things pop up at several times throughout the 2020 season was very, very un-Mercedes like, and almost I would dare to say unprecedented.
I agree. And I think if we flash back to 2019, we've seen Mercedes make mistakes. I think sometimes you might be able to cite external circumstances for the reasons. I'm not necessarily one that's going to put a lot of kind of negativity around the incident in Monza, which obviously the pit lane was closed. They brought Hamilton in. He got that 10-second stop go penalty, which ultimately cost him the race and teed up the race for somebody else that we'll probably speak to in a couple of minutes. But you know, when I refer back to Sakhir and what happened with that double stack pit stop, that was something that I would expect to see from Haas 5 years ago when they're new to the sport and their mechanics and their engineers and their pit crew are new. To me, I think for any other team that's a pretty inexcusable mistake and probably would have cost people their jobs and ultimately their livelihood. I think because it's Mercedes and because they're typically such a reliable force, there's maybe something of a free pass, but that one was tough to stomach simply because I think at that point in the race, we were all excited and we were cheering for George Russell. Yeah. And we were building up this narrative, which is, hey, this driver who has never scored a championship point because he's driving a Williams gets the opportunity to run in Hamilton's car, and in his one and only opportunity, he wins the race. And what does that do to Hamilton's legacy? And you know what, as sports scribes, we're both getting excited because like, we can write about this and we can tweet about this and we can talk about this for weeks. It's so much great stuff, right? And then ultimately, Mercedes has that awful double stack, and it cost George Russell the win. Bottas, I think, finishes. Did Bottas finish? Yeah, he did finish in the points. He finished the disappointing, I think, 8th, but he wasn't running a great race regardless. But yeah, it's just. That one in particular, I think, really stings Mercedes just because of the impact that it had on that race and the impact that it ultimately had on Georgia's season.
Yeah, it does. I mean, the way that it worked out at Sakhir too, it was Bottas and Russell 8th and 9th. And, you know, it was funny too, because, I mean, not only did we want to see this guy win that race driving Lewis's car, but it's like, okay, maybe he's not going to win, but he's still good for a podium. And then look,
the puncture.
And then it's just like, God, you know, that this guy's been a rock star all weekend since he came in. He didn't fit into the car. He's wearing like smaller shoes and everything that he could do. And, you know, it's just that, you know, the typical root for the underdog kind of thing, because you go back, because he'd been close a couple of times. I mean, Vettel said after Mugello that he felt bad that he took that last point away from George because, you know, he finished 10th and, you know, he beat George to it. So, I mean, he'd been close a couple of times. And then the story kind of changed to, well, maybe he's not going to win the race. Maybe he's not going to get a podium, but please, please, please let this poor guy at least score a point when he's in the best car in the entire grid. So it really was unfortunate. And then I think that whole incident with the double stack and just how badly they botched it at Bahrain too, really just goes to underline just how much of an art it is, and it just makes it all that more impressive that how Red Bull is able to pull it off, and they've done it almost on a regular basis over not just over years. Basically, they've done it over years, and there's never been a hitch to it. So it really was. It was really, I think, it really highlighted the ineptitude on you know, the part of Mercedes, but also really highlighted you know, the teams that get it right, how good it and difficult it really is. But you already hinted at it, so we're going to go into the second half of our top 10 list. So number 6 is Pierre Gasly winning at Monza as a result of one of these moments. Obviously, there was a big incident with Charles Leclerc crashing, and it was really one of those, you know, it was really set up a very interesting finish to that race. Just to run down the final race classification, you had Gasly, Carlos Sainz, Lance Stroll, Lando Norris, Valtteri Bottas, Danny Ricciardo, Lewis Hamilton, Esteban Ocon, Danny Kvyat, and Sergio Perez, rounding out the top 10. And the thing that made it really impressive is that, well, not only did Gasly win it, just because the way that everything got shaken up because of the safety car, is that he managed to hold off Carlos Sainz, because that race goes in another couple of laps. We're talking about a completely different race winner, because he only beat Carlos to the line by 0.415 seconds. And, even Lance wasn't all that far back. He was only about 3.5 seconds behind those two. So that really was it was one of those nice moments that you get. And I kind of had one of those little question marks, little thoughts in my head afterwards. Is like, are we going to be sitting here in 10 or 15 years talking about this season, or doing a segment or talking about where are they now? And is Pierre Gasly going to be one of these guys like Olivier Panis, who won the Monaco Grand Prix in the mid 90s in a Ligier? Is this going to be the only time that he ever wins a race in Formula One? Of course, he's a young guy. There's still a lot of time for him to, in his career in Formula One. But the big question is, where does, how long will he stay with AlphaTauri? Is there going to be a step up, into a bigger team in the future? So it definitely was a good moment, a feel-good moment for Pierre Gasly, but also led to some more interesting, deeper questions about his future.
Yeah, completely. It's funny too, because I had forgotten how tight that race was at the end until I went back to revisit some of the highlights. I had completely forgotten what a battle it was between Sainz and Gasly on that, in particular that last lap. I thought it was pretty thrilling. And I also agree with you that if the race had gone another lap or two, especially given the fact that Sainz was within DRS distance of Gasly for almost that entire range, that he probably would have caught him, or at least made it much more interesting. But ultimately, I think as a storyline and a narrative for F1, like, the sport needed it. It was a great news story. It was the first race that AlphaTauri had won since 2008. Incidentally, they last won at Italy, their one and only previous race win, when Sebastian Vettel won with them before he made the transition over to Red Bull. It was the first time that a French driver had won since 1996, and you just mentioned who that was, and Olivier Panis. Like, there were so many good news stories that came out of this. And it's also remarkable as well that Sainz qualified well, and I think a lot of people forget how well he qualified that weekend. Like, he had great pace through practice and qualifying. So it wasn't necessarily a surprise that, given the fact that Hamilton was penalized with that 10-second stop-go incident, it probably wasn't a surprise that Sainz was in the mix. He qualified third. Bottas qualified second, but this was one of those race weekends where he vanished. He choked up a number of spots at the very beginning and just disappeared into the middle of the pack. And when you combine that ultimately with Hamilton's penalty, it kind of opened up this opportunity for some other drivers. What's really remarkable, though, is Gasly qualified 10th, Stroll qualified 8th. They both ended up with a podium. But I think the real kind of game changer here was, obviously, and it wasn't just Hamilton that was penalized for entering the pit when it was closed. Giovinazzi did as well. Ultimately, everyone else recognized that the pit was closed. It was just Hamilton just happened to be in a bad location at a bad time. It's debatable whether he should have entered, whether he saw the signage, whether the team should have let him know, whatever. It created some exciting circumstances. But what really allowed Gasly to win this race was he'd managed to sneak into the pit lane for a tire change immediately before the pit lane was closed. So whereas everybody else waited and they all clumped into the pit lane immediately following the reopening, Gasly had already gone through. So he put himself in a terrific position. But I think a couple of other things to remember from this race as well is it was a terrible race, obviously, Ferrari. If you remember, Vettel's tires disintegrated on the 6th lap. Leclerc's back end broke out and he had a terrible crash, which ultimately led to the red flag because they had to rebuild the integrity of that tire wall. Magnussen had that power unit failure, which ultimately led to the safety car, which led to the closure of the pit lane. But ultimately, we got to see 3 young, talented drivers on the podium in Gasly and Sainz and Stroll. Ultimately, though, it was a bit of a turning point in the season for Stroll as well, because he really struggled for the next 4 or 5 races until he got to Turkey and began to turn his season around a little bit. But ultimately, it was a great news story. And you just think about what plays in the media more. If you're talking about what's good for Formula One, had Hamilton won this race, it would have just been another procession. It would have been another typical race weekend. But Gasly wins, and it's front page news all over Europe and all over the sporting world. So I think it was a good thing for the sport, and it was one of the more exciting weekends for sure. And again, you have to feel for Gasly, because this is a guy who lost his Red Bull seat halfway through last season, managed to score a podium with AlphaTauri at the end of the season, and then ultimately wins a race this year with Red Bull's B team. What an awesome story. I was so happy for this, for that young man.
Yeah, absolutely. There were a number of underlined, threads in that one that really made it, like you say, like a real good feel-good story for him. And also, you have to remember, this was the point of the season that was a real nadir, a real low point for Red Bull themselves, because Max didn't even finish that race. And this is one of those, what was it? He had
great point.
six DNFs over the year. And this was, I think, pretty much as close to where they hit rock bottom, because they'd really been struggling at this point. And then again, you had Lewis really dropping down through the through the race order. Max was out of the race. Ferrari weren't in it. So the way that the safety cards, the red flag really set everything up, is that it really reshaped the running order. It really reshaped the grid, and it really set up a really exciting finish. So it really was.
The one other thing that's worth mentioning as well, and I may have done this subconsciously, but Lance Stroll was in a position to win this race after that restart, and he went hot into, I think, the second or third corner after the restart, lost a ton of positions, had to make up a ton of ground. So, we look back and hey, he had a podium. He was in a position to win this race, and he choked it up because he made a mistake, and he went deep into a corner because he was late on the brakes and locked up the tires. Ultimately, it's very fortunate that he had a podium, but he was in a position to win this race, and we probably don't talk about that enough, because ultimately the Gasly story was a great story. But I think it's probably worth commenting that, hey, Lance was in a position to win this race as well, and a simple mistake cost him that opportunity.
Yeah, he did say so afterwards, and it was just one of those things that kind of got lost in the the rest of the babble and all the other chatter going on. All right, well, we're going to take one final break here on the show tonight, and we're going to come back and we're going to count down 7, 8, 9, and 10. So don't go away, and you want to stick around for those, and we'll be back to do so in just a moment. All right, well, welcome back to the show. Mark and Mark here, counting down our top 10 moments of the 2020 Formula One season. We've been through 1 to 6, so we're going to pick it up with number 7, and that is Romain Grosjean's huge crash in Bahrain towards the end of the season, third race from the end of the year. And again, the discussion, I think, from the halo, even though as unsightly as it is, and as much discussion as that provoked when it was first introduced, the discussion regarding the relevancy of whether it is or is not a game changer when it comes to safety, I think that was put to rest a while ago. I think that just underlines the entire discussion, because I mean, he walked away from a crash that he probably should not have walked away from, and more to the point is that he walked away from a crash that his head probably should not have been still attached to his body by the time the car came to a stop, to put it in a quite a blunt and graphic kind of manner, because it was just horrifying to watch.
It was absolutely, and I still think back to that race, and we're watching the race, and we have this long shot of the straight with the cars coming towards you, and you can see the cars coming down the straight. You can see Grosjean leave the track, and you can see the fireball. So we actually saw that live, and there was no way that the TV broadcasters could have done anything about that. So we knew something of significance had happened, and you don't see explosions like that in modern Formula One. Maybe 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, when the fuel cell was in a different place and they carried more fuel and there was less reliance on an electrical component, but you just don't see that. And you and I talked so much about this. It was very troubling to continue watching that race, not knowing what was happening. And great job to the producers and to the commentators for kind of alleviating some of our fears and distracting us a little bit. But ultimately, when we got that cut of Grosjean walking away, it was one of those moments where, okay, thank goodness he's okay. But I don't think any of us realized how much danger he had been in until subsequent to the race, when we began to see some more of the footage and when we began to see the wreckage of the car. So we saw the flames, we saw the fireball, and we saw him leaving the scene. But I don't think it was really until after the race, at least in my case, it wasn't until subsequent to the completion of the race that I began seeing the footage and dissecting the footage and seeing the GIFs, and seeing the photos of the wreckage of the car, and seeing the barriers that had been separated and punctured apart by the halo itself, that I began to realize, like, oh my God, because during the race, we knew something had happened. We knew it was bad, but it wasn't really until subsequent to the race that we could begin to dissect it and understand what had happened, how lucky he was, and how fortunate it is that the FIA and Formula One had instituted the halo. Because to your point, like, we're not just saying, hey, you know what, we're being dramatic and we're trying to make a point and we're incorporating a whole bunch of hyperbole. He would have been dead. Like, there's no question whatsoever. He escaped that that crash, purely because of the existence of the halo. And to this day, it's just remarkable that that crash happened. And it's remarkable that he was able to walk away. But all the credit in the world to the FIA and Formula One for instituting some safety hardware that enabled that to happen, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, it is. It all really comes about. I was thinking about it too. Was the halo was almost destined after Jules Bianchi's crash at Suzuka a number of years ago. What was that, 2014, 2015? I mean, and it's
2014.
2014. And when you look at the two accidents, I mean, the way that poor old Jules, like the accident itself almost happened in slow motion, the way that he slipped off the track at Suzuka under very, very treacherous and slippery circumstances and slid into this this tractor or whatever it was that was
the tractor.
Yeah, I can't remember whose car that they were actually, because they were under a virtual safety car at the time. And then
Exactly.
it was sort of a slow motion accident, and his eventual demise, I mean, that was a slow motion. It was just a horrible thing. And I mean, you almost expected to see Jules get out of the car and walk away from that one, and
Yeah.
he didn't. And then you flip that around to Grosjean's accident, which there were so many things going on. You had the fire, you had the way that he impacted the barrier, the way that the car came to a rest, that you would not expect somebody to get out of a car in that situation and then only have something as minor as burns onto his hand. Not that those are minor, but all things considering, was really quite remarkable. So that the funny thing is too, and I know that video games are no real indication of reality, but I was playing the F1 video game over the holiday break here, and I was racing at Bahrain, and I find that the graphics model very well, and it's very interesting when you go around. You go from start finish. You go into that the right hander, then the left hander, and that little dog leg back to the right before you go down that straightaway. And in the Codemasters has done a very good job. That little barrier where that little access road that runs on the inside of the track that Grosjean hit, that's actually modeled. You can actually see like
Wow.
stewards and whatnot standing there, and it does not stand out significantly from the rest of the scenery. And I haven't been able to go back and find like an in-car camera from like one of the replays. I've gone back and I didn't really notice it on Kvyat's as much, because you got Roma hitting his left front wheel and then skidding across, so it's a little bit of obscured. But it really was the one scenario that I don't think that they ever planned for when they designed it. But horrible situation, obviously, and thank goodness that he walked away. And sadly, that was his final thing that he'll be probably remembered for in Formula One, because at the age he's at now and the fact that he's out at Haas, I don't think we're going to see Roman back in Formula One in the future. Anyways, moving on to number 8, and this is a big one, but we'll try and keep it to a couple of minutes here as best we can. And that is the continued struggle of the Scuderia Ferrari, and just all the problems that they continue to have. I mean, Turkey was their best race of the entire year. 6th in the World Championship in 2020, 131 points. Compare that to 573 for Mercedes. I mean, even look at where Red Bull finished up with 319 points. I mean, in the last number of years, you would have expected, Mercedes, Ferrari, and Red Bull. So you would, Ferrari had been on form like they've been up till the end of 2018. You would have expected to see them somewhere in between Mercedes and Red Bull. Obviously, I don't think if Ferrari was on form, that 573 at Mercedes would have been as big, and they probably would have taken points away from both the Mercedes and Red Bull. But again, we're going to go back and rehash what we talked about a number of times throughout the year. Mark, was the the secret decision that came out about this time last year about the legality of their the power unit, and it was reflected not just in the works team but also the customer teams, just how underpowered that engine was this year. And that old saying, where there's smoke there's fire. If it walks like a duck and it talks like a duck, use any any of the one of those sayings you want. I mean, there was something obviously that wasn't kosher about that power unit. And Max back in 2019 saying that, hey, these guys are just straight up cheating, more or less, is what he said at the time. And they've struggled ever since, and they just are a shadow of their former selves. And considering we're going into this weird kind of in-between year where we're having the current formula extended another year, that what with the limited opportunities and possibilities for development on the current cars and power units, that we might see some improvements on the car going into next year. But honestly, I think if you're a Ferrari fan, that you're probably putting more hope in 2022 before as more of a realistic turning point and revival of fortunes and race wins, podiums, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, what's really remarkable about this team as well is, even if you flash back to 2019, when they were still very competitive for reasons that we obviously discovered later were fairly nefarious, even when they were competitive, or at least they were putting competitive cars on the grid, this team was just surrounded by noise and the cloud regarding the team orders and the relationship between Leclerc and Vettel, right? Vettel's first 4 or 5 years with Ferrari, he was clearly the number one driver. He had the opportunity to win a couple of championships. He came up short, obviously, in 17. He came up short in 18, which was probably the year he probably should have won. And then ultimately, Raikkonen was moved to, Alfa Romeo. I always struggle with that one. I still want to call it Sauber, but obviously he made the move to Alfa Romeo. And then all of a sudden, Vettel was in a position in 2019 where he was paired with a driver who had the capability to win on any given race weekend. So even though the team was competitive on the track in 2019, there was still a lot of noise surrounding that team. And then you obviously go, to your point, into the offseason last year, and there's this kind of secretive agreement between the FIA and Formula One. It threw F1 Twitter and Reddit into a fury because everyone wanted to understand, and we didn't understand why the penalty wasn't greater, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But ultimately, Ferrari is penalized because they're forced to field the power unit during the season, which is woefully uncompetitive. And then you kind of combine that as well with some of the personnel decisions around this team, right? Like, I don't know that there was a kind of a foregone conclusion, or that it was a foregone conclusion that this team was interested in re-upping Vettel. I mean, ultimately, he's an older driver. He's not a pay driver. He probably doesn't bring a ton of sponsorship to the team at this point. There's probably not a lot of value in Ferrari retaining his services, but ultimately, the way that situation played out in the forum of public opinion and how his departure kind of broke in the media wasn't necessarily a positive look on Ferrari. And as it turns out, this is a team that, long before it was announced to the public that he wasn't going to retain his seat, had already gone to Carlos Sainz and kind of had a handshake agreement that he was going to join the Scuderia for the following season. And then it was kind of interesting as well that all of a sudden, Vettel, who's never been a disliked driver, but because he doesn't have a strong personality and he's not a Hamilton, and he's by no means polarizing, but he's never been somebody that has kind of the type of following that a Max Verstappen would have, or that even a Lewis Hamilton would have at certain races. All of a sudden, there seemed to be this tide change, and all of a sudden, there was this massive wave of sympathy for Sebastian Vettel, and that Ferrari's done him wrong, and he deserves better than this, and he deserves a seat for next season. And ultimately, he did get a seat, and it took a long time to play out. But ultimately, just as ugly as his departure was from Ferrari, it required an ugly departure of Sergio Perez from Racing Point to get him that seat. But yeah, overall, the season was a mess. It was a mess from a mechanical perspective and a power unit perspective. Obviously, I think there was pretty significant damage done to their relationship with Haas and Alfa Romeo. And I've read in a couple of places that Ferrari is looking to make that relationship right via some fairly significant financial compensation packages to those teams. And I think we've spoken as well about the fact that Haas is going to be more closely integrated into the Ferrari operations in Italy to give them better access to Ferrari resources, et cetera, et cetera. But ultimately, the season was a disaster, both on the track and ultimately off the track. And to your point, their best finish of the year was a 3-4 in Turkey, and it was Vettel's only podium. So it was obviously a tough year. And to your point as well, the driver lineups obviously settled for next year. You're going to see Carlos Sainz, and you're ultimately going to see Charles Leclerc. The way they've invested in Charles Leclerc in terms of his contract and the financial commitment, he's obviously their long-term project. He is obviously the individual that they see building their team around. But I think, just as you and I talked about a couple of weeks ago as well, I don't know that the Carlos Sainz situation is necessarily long-term. If Mick Schumacher can show any signs of competitiveness in that woefully terrible Haas car next year, I don't think they're going to wait to bring him, because I think the marketing opportunities that he brings to this team would be absolutely unparalleled in Formula One. And I think it's absolutely in their interest to get him onto that team if he's even 85% of the driver that Carlos Sainz is. So yeah, I think Ferrari had a terrible season. I don't know that the results are going to be any better next year, which is good news if you're McLaren or if you're Racing Point, Aston Martin, because it means there's going to be tons of points available on any given race weekend. So yeah, terrible season for Ferrari, and I don't necessarily see, at least mechanically, it getting a whole lot better in 2021.
Absolutely. And I have absolutely nothing further to add. I think you summed it up nicely. I mean, I do have a lot to say about Ferrari. This is just a top 10 show. I don't want to open up that can of worms. So we'll just go right on to number 9. And this is a big one. That's the withdrawal from Formula One of Honda out at the end of 2021. Obviously, they're going to be throwing everything, including the kitchen sink, into it for 2021 to help Red Bull win the championship. Red Bull themselves have tried to stack the odds in their favor with their arguably strongest driver lineup that they've had since 2018, when it was Verstappen and Danny Ricciardo. This year, they're going to be going in with Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez. And I think it's really interesting to see what Checo is going to be able to do in a competitive car like the Renault. The Renault, I've misspoken. The Renault, pardon me. And see what he can do in that car. But it's really going to be interesting. And I guess the big question is how good of a car are they going to be able to design and build? You're going to think it's going to be pretty good, considering this is a design team that is led by Adrian Newey, and his record in Formula One and motorsport speaks for itself, bar none. And then also the amount of power that they're going to get out of this Honda power unit for next year. And then I get an interesting side story to this is, are Red Bull going to be able to take over Honda's engine department and become a true manufacturer in their own right going into 2022?
Yeah, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, and I think there's every reason to think that Red Bull will be equally, if not more competitive in 2021. You have to consider a couple of things. One is they had a lot of bad luck in 2020, despite the fact that they finished second in the championship. Obviously, Alexander Albon underperformed relative to what anyone in that car should have been able to do, and that their top driver, Max Verstappen, had 5 retirements. In fact, it's remarkable. There was only one race last season where Max wasn't either on the podium or retired, and he finished 6th. I mean, ultimately, if they can convert some of those retirements into podiums or points finishes, and ultimately they can replace Alexander Albon with a more competitive driver, I think they're going to be in a really good position. And you know what? We talked about the fact that Mercedes made some mistakes last year. It really didn't contribute to a really significant deficit in points accumulation. So I have to believe that Mercedes will probably cough up some points next year. They're going to have some retirements. They're going to have some DNFs. Ultimately, I can't imagine them being as reliable over the course of a 20-plus race campaign as they were over this shortened season. And I think when you pair this team with Sergio Perez, I have every reason to think they're going to be better. Now, that said, I don't think for a second they're going to compete for a Constructors' Championship, but I think they're going to put more pressure on Mercedes in 2021 than they did in this season. Now, to your earlier point as well, I am a little bit saddened by the decision of Honda to leave the sport, right? Like, this is the second time now in 12 years that they've left Formula One. They They walked away from the sport in 2008 at the height of the global financial crisis, and they ultimately sold the team on to Ross Brawn and his consortium at a significant discount. He was obviously able to then partner that car with a Mercedes engine. They became Mercedes. The rest is history. They rejoined the sport in 2015 in a shock move to supply McLaren with power units. It's believed that to date, they've spent more than $1 billion in their investments into that engine IP and that engine development. And really, until they got to Red Bull, they really hadn't been able to convert any of that money into podiums. And now, all of a sudden, where they are achieving podiums and achieving race wins, I mean, let's not forget that Max finished the season on a high with a race win in Abu Dhabi. They're walking away from the sport. And I think ultimately there's a lot of reasons for it. I think the gut reaction from a lot of analysts is that, hey, this is a decision that's being driven by the COVID situation and that it's not necessarily the right time to be investing in what is really a vanity project. When you're building power units, but you're not actually a works team, it's more of a vanity project than it is anything. And if you look at Honda's long-term ambitions, obviously this is a company that wants to be carbon neutral by 2050. They want 2/3 of their passenger car sales to be electric by 2030, spending hundreds of millions of dollars to designing a hybrid power unit for Formula One cars when that's not necessarily kind of that trickle down experience to your road cars. It doesn't really make sense. That said, and we talked about this before as well, it was by all accounts a very, very tight decision at Formula or at Honda HQ in Tokyo as to whether to continue this project or not. There was a thought at one point that, hey, maybe they would re-up through 2022 or 2023, but ultimately they made the decision to back out in 2021. And then to your earlier point, it leaves Red Bull now in this very precarious situation where they, at this moment, have no engine supplier beyond 2021. And ultimately, I don't know who they would go to anyways, because it's not going to be Mercedes because that relationship simply doesn't exist. Yep. It's never going to be Ferrari. You know what? AlphaTauri had tried a Ferrari power unit before, but ultimately, I don't think they want that power unit knowing where it is from a competitive standpoint. Can they go back to Renault? Probably not. You got to think those bridges are burned forever. And then ultimately with the resources that this team has, and you spoke to a couple of minutes ago, I think internally what they want to be able to do is buy that Honda IP and simply continue developing that engine based on all of the resources and the factory and the production tools that they currently have. So I think that's their ambition. If that's not possible, I do not know where that leaves Red Bull heading into 2022. Holy moly.
Yeah, it is, like you say, it's a very, very precarious, thin line that they're walking at the moment. So they really are hedging all their bets to sort something out with Honda. Who knows where that's going to go? Whether or not there's going to be some announcement made of that in the coming weeks and months. I mean, I think Abiteboul did publicly say that there would be a possibility to perhaps resupply Red Bull with Renault power, but yeah, I don't know if that was just maybe a public statement, more of a, I'm not going to be a dick in public. I'm just going to
totally
say, so like you say, I mean, those bridges may be burned, but certainly it's going to be a very, very fascinating situation to watch next year, both on and off the track for Red Bull. And here we are. We've got 9 down, 1 to go. And the last one for our top 10 moments of 2020 was actually not on the track, but off of it. And that was the We Race as One campaign that kicked off in Formula One. Mark, you want to speak to this one first?
Yeah, I will. And let's flash back a little bit. So the season began on July 5th. And when you consider the timing, we were coming out of that initial peak wave of COVID, and I think things were dying down. Western Europe was really getting a handle on the situation. But I think at that point, from a society perspective and culturally, I think there was a really great appreciation for our essential workers and frontline workers and medical workers. But at the same time, there was this global kind of conversation about social equality. And it really had been kickstarted in the US based on some circumstances there, some things that had happened. And US athletes and US celebrities and many US politicians had really kind of kickstarted this social equality movement. And on June 22nd, Formula One, led obviously by the Liberty Group, kicked off its We Race as One initiative. And it kind of detailed or kind of broke it out into a couple of different buckets. And, just kind of as a refresher here, this is their program. So hashtag We Race as One. We race to compete. We race for the exhilaration. We race because it's in our blood, but to change our sport for the better and change the world for good, and have to race for something bigger, for frontline workers, for inclusion and equality, for a more sustainable future. We race as one. And, for the first couple of races, they did something. I mean, ultimately, Formula One, Liberty, the FIA, they contributed a little bit of money, not a lot, but they contributed a little bit of money towards social equality movements and opportunities at the first couple of races. And these were haphazard, poorly organized, largely disorganized experiences at the beginning or the end of the races, where the drivers got together and they just kind of embraced social equality. And it was a bit of a miss, and it was very, very highly criticized. And Hamilton, and I don't know if you remember this, but Hamilton said, and I quote, he said, following the initial kickoff of We Race as One, and I think there was a lot of kind of hope that this could be something bigger, but Hamilton himself said, and I quote, F1 was not doing enough. The campaign lacked leadership, and they had presented a campaign that required better coordination. So he was very, very critical. And, I lean into Hamilton here, and I respect his opinion, because ultimately you talk about a lot of these F1 drivers. For starters, they're white. A lot of them come from privileged backgrounds. A lot of them come from Western Europe. So a lot of the things that F1's We Race as One was designed to kind of rally around and improve are things and experiences that none of them would ever have encountered in their daily lives. Where Hamilton, growing up middle class, growing up in a less affluent city in the UK, having faced a lot of these challenges, he's probably better to speak to this. So ultimately, he was disappointed in the execution of this. And then you talk as well just about some of the bigger decisions that Formula One had made during the season. This was the season that they really leaned into their relationship with Aramco, which is, of course, the state-owned oil company from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. You lead into the fact that they're now going to race in Saudi Arabia, and it looks like it's a 10-year deal that's going to kick off in Jeddah at the end of next season. You look at the fact that the Mazepin situation happens at the end of 2020, and ultimately the FIA and Formula One are content to let Haas ultimately kind of be the disciplinarian in that case, if there wasn't any discipline at all. They come forward with this big marketing campaign, and it promised a lot, but I don't know that we necessarily saw anything come of it. So it was neat that they were able to put the stickers on the car, put the digital banners on the TV program, but ultimately I don't know if there was anything of substance here. And I really defer to Hamilton, and Hamilton, I think, has been highly suspect and highly critical of the campaign itself.
Yeah, well, it always came across as slightly disorganized, slightly clumsy, slightly awkward, as if the people.
Yes, all of those things.
It seemed well-intentioned, but it seemed it was being implemented by people that were trying to do the right thing, but obviously didn't know enough about the situations they were trying to address to actually implement it properly. So yeah, it always kind of had this disjointed feel about it. But then also, further to your points about the deal with Aramco, and then the Saudi Grand Prix thing coming up for next year, and the Mazepin situation, there's so many things conflicting here. It just really kind of muddies the message. It's just like, okay, well, where really are the priorities? Where, how much of this is just lip service? How much of this is serious? And, I completely, understand. Well, I can't completely understand where Lewis is coming from, but to a very, minimal amount, I can understand why he might be critical, why he might be frustrated, and why he feels the need that somebody else needs to take go on point and provide leadership and direction to this initiative, because it really needs a good kick in the right direction to get it going.
And I really think it comes down to the fact that, obviously, as most big private companies are, you have a marketing team, and you have a business operations team, and you have a sales team. And I think ultimately the business team, the business arm of the Liberty Groups, you need to go out and generate revenue. We are hemorrhaging cash during the COVID situation.
Yep.
And they say, well, Aramco is a great sponsor, and they're going to be reliable, and they're putting up a ton of cash, and we need that cash. And likewise, the race organizer in Jeddah and ultimately Riyadh, where they're going to build a purpose-built racetrack, they're going to give us $50 million a year to host a race. So the business and the business operations team, they're doing what they're being tasked to do by Liberty, which is generate revenue and bring aboard sponsors. And yet the marketing team, they're being tasked with creating a more inclusive sport, which is more it's friendly to a broader demographic and is designed to bring in new fans and female fans and fans of other countries. Like, so they're both doing their things. They're just completely incompatible with each other. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like, I feel like they're both executing, but there's no kind of coordination within the organization itself.
Yeah, exactly. They're both executing and doing what they're tasked to do, but yeah, there's no common, there's very
Exactly
overlap in the middle.
Exactly.
Anyways, I think we've pretty well covered it. Well, we haven't. We could have gone in depth to any one of those 10 points that we went down, but there you go. That's I think as much justice as we can do in the time that we had this afternoon. So that's it. If you guys agree or disagree, you want to add in your own moments, by all means do so. Hit us up on Twitter at Scuderia F1 Pod or email us at scuderiaf1pod@gmail.com. Leave a comment in the comment sections below. If you're watching on YouTube, that's all appreciated. We love all the feedback that we get. We got some comments, we got some emails, some tweets over the holiday period, and we'll address those once we get back to our regular show later this week and over the weeks and months to come. So keep them coming. We love it. We love interacting and talking with you guys. And that's it. That's all I got. Unless you've got anything else, Mark. I think
no,
we're all good.
I'm good to go. Happy New Year, everybody. We can't wait for a crazy 2021 calendar, and we'll speak to everybody soon.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys. Take care, and we'll talk to you again very, very soon. Bye for now.